Hound of Conscience by Saint Catherine of Siena. God the Father tells Saint Catherine of Siena that the ungrateful are like fools, who ignore him and the labors of his servants, and as a result, his mercy towards them becomes judgment and the means of their ruin. The Father also explains that if a man barters and sells the God-given gifts that he has received with the devil, then the devil gains rights to take away all that the man has obtained in this life. The following Virgo Potens production is a narrated video of excerpts from the dialogue by Saint Catherine of Siena, narrated by Tony Capobianco. The text of the dialogue by Saint Catherine of Siena is in the public domain. All of the pictures used in this video are also in the public domain. The dialogue, Part 1b. What fruit do they receive? The fruit which I destine for them, constrained by the prayers of my servants, is that I give them light, and that I wake up in them the hound of conscience, and make them smell the odor of virtue, and take delight in the conversation of my servants. Sometimes I allow the world to show them what it is, so that, feeling its diverse and various passions, they may know how little stability it has, and may come to lift their desire beyond it, and seek their native country, which is the eternal life. And so I draw them by these, and by many other ways, for the eye cannot see, nor the tongue relate, nor the heart think, how many are the roads and ways which I use, through love alone, to lead them back to grace, so that my truth may be fulfilled in them. I am constrained to do so by that inestimable love of mine, by which I created them, and by the love, desire, and grief of my servants, since I am no despiser of their tears and sweet and humble prayers. Rather, I accept them inasmuch as I am he who give them this love for the good of souls and grief for their loss. But I do not, in general, grant to these others for whom they pray satisfaction for the penalty due to them, but only for their guilt, since they are not disposed on their side to receive with perfect love my love and that of my servants. They do not receive their grief with bitterness and perfect contrition for the sins they have committed, but with imperfect love and contrition. Wherefore they have not, as others, remission of the penalty, but only of the guilt, because such complete satisfaction requires proper dispositions on both sides, both in him that gives and him that receives. Wherefore, since they are imperfect, they receive imperfectly the perfection of the desires of those who offer them to me, for their sakes with suffering, and inasmuch as I told you that they do receive remission, this is indeed the truth, that by the way which I have told you, that is, by the light of conscience, and by other things, satisfaction is made for their guilt. For, beginning to learn, they vomit forth the corruption of their sins, and so receive the gift of grace. These are they who are in a state of ordinary charity, wherefore, if they have trouble, they receive it in the guise of correction, and do not resist overmuch the clemency of the Holy Spirit, but, coming out of their sin, they receive the life of grace. But if, like fools, they are ungrateful, and ignore me and the labors of my servants done for them, that which was given them through mercy turns to their own ruin and judgment, not through defect of mercy, nor through defect of him who implored the mercy for the ingrate, but solely through the man's own wretchedness and hardiness, with which, with the hands of his free will, he has covered his heart, as it were, with a diamond, which, if it be not broken by the blood, can in no way be broken. And yet I say to you, that in spite of his hardness of heart, he can use his free will while he has time, praying for the blood of my Son, and let him with his own hand apply it to the diamond over his heart and shiver it, and he will receive the imprint of the blood which has been paid for him. But if he delays until the time be past, he has no remedy, because he has not used the dowry which I gave him, giving him memory so as to remember my benefits, intellect so as to see and know the truth, affection so that he should love me, the eternal truth, whom he would have known through the use of his intellect. This is the dowry which I have given you all, and which ought to render fruit to me, the Father. But if a man barters and sells it to the devil, if he choose, has a right to seize on everything that he has acquired in this life. And filling his memory with the delights of sin, and with the recollection of shameful pride, avarice, self-love, hatred, and unkindness to his neighbors, being also a persecutor of my servants, with these miseries he has obscured his intellect by his disordinate will. Let such as these receive the eternal pains with their horrible stench, inasmuch as they have not satisfied for their sins with contrition and displeasure of their guilt. Now, therefore, you have understood how suffering satisfies for guilt by perfect contrition, not through the finite pain, and such as have this contrition in perfection satisfy not only for the guilt, but also for the penalty which follows the guilt, as I have already said when speaking in general. And if they satisfy for the guilt alone, that is, if, having abandoned mortal sin, they receive grace and have not sufficient contrition and love to satisfy for the penalty also, they go to the pains of purgatory, passing through the second and last means of satisfaction. So you see that satisfaction is made through the desire of the soul united to me, who am the infinite good, in greater or lesser degree, according to the measure of love, obtained by the desire and prayer of the recipient. Wherefore, with that very same measure with which a man measures to me, does he receive in himself the measure of my goodness. Labor, therefore, to increase the fire of your desire, and let not a moment pass without crying to me with humble voice, or without continual prayers before me for your neighbors. I say this to you, and to the Father of your soul, whom I have given you on earth. Bear yourselves with manful courage, and make yourselves dead to all your own sensuality. How very pleasing to God is the willing desire to suffer for him. Very pleasing to me, dearest daughter, is the willing desire to bear every pain and fatigue, even unto death, for the salvation of souls. For the more the soul endures, the more she knows that she loves me. Loving me, she comes to know more of my truth, and the more she knows, the more pain and intolerable grief she feels at the offenses committed against me. You asked me to sustain you, and to punish the faults of others in you, and you did not remark that you were really asking for love, light, and knowledge of the truth, since I have already told you that, by the increase of love, grows grief and pain. Wherefore he that grows in love grows in grief. Therefore I say to you all that you should ask, and it will be given you. For I deny nothing to him who asks me in truth. Consider that the love of divine charity is so closely joined in the soul with perfect patience, that neither can leave the soul without the other. For this reason, if the soul elect to love me, she should elect to endure pains for me in whatever mode or circumstance I may send them to her. Patience cannot be proved in any other way than by suffering, and patience is united with love, as has been said. Therefore, bear yourselves with manly courage, for unless you do so, you will not prove yourselves to be spouses of my truth, and faithful children, nor of the company of those who relish the taste of my honor, and the salvation of souls. How every virtue and every defect is obtained by means of our neighbor. I wish also that you should know that every virtue is obtained by means of your neighbor, and likewise every defect. He, therefore, who stands in hatred of me, does an injury to his neighbor, and to himself, who is his own chief neighbor, and this injury is both general and particular. It is general because you are obliged to love your neighbor as yourself, and loving him, you ought to help him spiritually, with prayer, counseling with words, and assisting him both spiritually and temporally, according to the need in which he may be, at least with your good will, if you have nothing else. A man, therefore, who does not love does not help him, and thereby does himself an injury. For he cuts off from himself grace, and injures his neighbor, by depriving him of the benefit of the prayers and of the sweet desires that he is bound to offer for him to me. Thus, every act of help that he performs should proceed from the charity which he has through love of me. And every evil also is done by means of his neighbor, for if he does not love me, he cannot be in charity with his neighbor, and thus all evils derive from the soul's deprivation of love of me and her neighbor, whence, inasmuch as such a man does no good, it follows that he must do evil. To whom does he evil? First of all to himself, and then to his neighbor. Not against me, for no evil can touch me, except insofar as I count done to me that which he does to himself. To himself he does the injury of sin, which deprives him of grace, and worse than this, he cannot do to his neighbor. Him he injures in not paying him the debt, which he owes him, of love, with which he ought to help him by means of prayer and holy desire offered to me for him. This is an assistance which is owed in general to every rational creature, but its usefulness is more particular when it is done to those who are close at hand, under your eyes, as to whom I say, you are all obliged to help one another by word and doctrine, and the example of good works, and in every other respect in which your neighbor may be seen to be in need, counseling him exactly as you would yourselves, without any passion of self-love. And he, a man not loving God, does not do this, because he has no love towards his neighbor, and by not doing it, he does him, as you see, a special injury. And he does him evil, not only by not doing him the good that he might do him, but by doing him a positive injury and a constant evil. In this way, sin causes a physical and a mental injury. The mental injury is already done when the sinner has conceived pleasure in the idea of sin, and hatred of virtue, that is, pleasure from sensual self-love, which has deprived him of the affection of love which he ought to have towards me and his neighbor, as has been said. And after he has conceived, he brings forth one sin after another against his neighbor, according to the diverse ways which may please his perverse sensual will. Sometimes it is seen that he brings forth cruelty, and that both in general and in particular. His general cruelty is to see himself and other creatures in danger of death and damnation through privation of grace, and so cruel is he that he reminds neither himself nor others of the love of virtue and hatred of vice. Being thus cruel, he may wish to extend his cruelty still further. That is, not content with not giving an example of virtue, the villain also usurps the office of the demons, tempting, according to his power, his fellow creatures to abandon virtue for vice. This is cruelty towards his neighbors, for he makes himself an instrument to destroy life and to give death. Cruelty towards the body has its origin in cupidity, which not only prevents a man from helping his neighbor, but causes him to seize the goods of others, robbing the poor creatures. Sometimes this is done by the arbitrary use of power, and at other times by cheating and fraud, his neighbor being forced to redeem to his own loss his own goods, and often indeed his own person. O miserable vice of cruelty, which will deprive the man who practices it of all mercy, unless he turn to kindness and benevolence towards his neighbor. Sometimes the sinner brings forth insults on which often follows murder, sometimes also impurity against the person of his neighbor, by which he becomes a brute beast full of stench. And in this case he does not poison one only, but whoever approaches him with love or in conversation is poisoned. Against whom does pride bring forth evils? Against the neighbor, through love of one's own reputation, whence comes hatred of the neighbor, reputing oneself to be greater than he, and in this way is injury done to him. And if a man be in a position of authority, he produces also injustice and cruelty, and becomes a retailer of the flesh of men. O dearest daughter, grieve for the offense against me, and weep over these corpses, so that by prayer the bands of their death may be loosened. See now that in all places and in all kinds of people, sin is always produced against the neighbor, and through this medium, in no other way could sin ever be committed, either secret or open. A secret sin is when you deprive your neighbor of that which you ought to give him. An open sin is where you perform positive acts of sin, as I have related to you. It is, therefore, indeed the truth that every sin done against me is done through the medium of the neighbor. How virtues are accomplished by means of our neighbor, and how it is that virtues differ to such an extent in creatures. I have told you how all sins are accomplished by means of your neighbor, through the principles which I exposed to you, that is, because men are deprived of the affection of love, which gives light to every virtue. In the same way, self-love, which destroys charity and affection towards the neighbor, is the principle and foundation of every evil. All scandals, hatred, cruelty, and every sort of trouble proceed from this perverse root of self-love, which has poisoned the entire world and weakened the mystical body of the Holy Church, and the universal body of the believers in the Christian religion. And therefore I said to you that it was in the neighbor, that is to say, in the love of him, that all virtues were founded. And truly, indeed did I say to you, that charity gives life to all the virtues, because no virtue can be obtained without charity, which is the pure love of me. Wherefore, when the soul knows herself, as we have said above, she finds humility and hatred of her own sensual passion, for she learns the perverse law which is bound up in her members, and which ever fights against the spirit. And therefore, arising with hatred of her own sensuality, crushing it under the heel of reason, with great earnestness, she discovers in herself the bounty of my goodness, through the many benefits which she has received from me, all of which she considers again in herself. She attributes to me, through humility, the knowledge which she has obtained of herself, knowing that, by my grace, I have drawn her out of darkness and lifted her up into the light of true knowledge. When she has recognized my goodness, she loves it without any medium, and yet at the same time with a medium, that is to say, without the medium of herself or of any advantage accruing to herself, and with the medium of virtue, which she has conceived through love of me. But by conceiving hatred of sin and love of virtue, and when she has thus conceived by the affection of love, she immediately is delivered of fruit for her neighbor, because in no other way can she act out of the truth she has conceived in herself, but, loving me in truth, in the same truth she serves her neighbor. And it cannot be otherwise, because love of me and of her neighbor are one and the same thing. And so far as the soul loves me, she loves her neighbor, because love towards him issues from me. This is the means which I have given you, that you may exercise and prove your virtue therewith. Because, inasmuch as you can do me no profit, you should do it to your neighbor. This proves that you possess me by grace in your soul, producing much fruit for your neighbor, and making prayers to me, seeking with sweet and amorous desire my honor and the salvation of souls. The soul, enamored of my truth, never ceases to serve the whole world in general, and more or less in a particular case according to the disposition of the recipient and the ardent desire of the donor, as I have shown above, when I declared to you that the endurance of suffering alone without desire was not sufficient to punish a fault. When she has discovered the advantage of this unitive love in me, by means of which she truly loves herself, extending her desire for the salvation of the whole world, thus coming to the aid of its neediness, she strives, inasmuch as she has done good to herself, by the conception of virtue, from which she has drawn the life of grace, to fix her eye on the needs of her neighbor in particular. Wherefore, when she has discovered through the affection of love the state of all rational creatures in general, she helps those who are at hand, according to the various graces which I have entrusted to her to administer. One she helps with doctrine, that is, with words, giving sincere counsel without any respect of persons. Another with the example of a good life, and this indeed all give to their neighbor, the edification of a holy and honorable life. These are the virtues, and many others, too many to enumerate, which are brought forth in the love of the neighbor, but although I have given them in such a different way, that is to say, not all to one, but to one virtue, and to another another, it so happens that it is impossible to have one without having them all, because all the virtues are bound together. Wherefore, learn that in many cases I give one virtue to be as it were the chief of the others. That is to say, to one I will give principally love, to another justice, to another humility, to one a lively faith, to another prudence or temperance, or patience, to another fortitude. These and many other virtues I place indifferently in the souls of many creatures. It happens, therefore, that the particular one so placed in the soul becomes the principal object of its virtue, the soul disposing herself for her chief conversation to this rather than to other virtues, and by the effect of this virtue, the soul draws to herself all the other virtues, which, as has been said, are all bound together in the affection of love. And so, with many gifts and graces of virtue, and not only in the case of spiritual things, but also of temporal. I use the word temporal for the things necessary to the physical life of man. All these I have given indifferently, and I have not placed them all in one soul, in order that man should, perforce, have material for love of his fellow. I could easily have created men possessed of all that they should need both for body and soul, but I wish that one should have need of the other, and that they should be my ministers to administer the graces and the gifts that they have received from me. Whether men will or no, he cannot help making an act of love. It is true, however, that that act, unless made through love of me, profits him nothing, so far as grace is concerned. See then that I have made men my ministers, and placed them in diverse stations and various ranks, in order that they may make use of the virtue of love. Wherefore I show you that in my house are many mansions, and that I wish for no other thing than love. For in the love of me is fulfilled and completed the love of the neighbor and the law observed. For he only can be of use in his state of life who is bound to me with this love. How virtues are proved and fortified by their contraries. Up to the present I have taught you how a man may serve his neighbor, and manifest by that service the love of which he has towards me. Now I wish to tell you further that a man proves his patience on his neighbor when he receives injuries from him. Similarly, he proves his humility on a proud man, his faith on an infidel, his true hope on one who despairs, his justice on the unjust, his kindness on the cruel, his gentleness and benignity on the irascible. Good men produce and prove all their virtues on their neighbor, just as perverse men all their vices. Thus, if you consider well, humility is proved on pride in this way. The humble man extinguishes pride, because a proud man can do no harm to a humble one. Neither can the infidelity of a wicked man, who neither loves me nor hopes in me, when brought forth against one who is faithful to me, do him any harm. His infidelity does not diminish the faith or the hope of him who has conceived his faith and hope through love of me. It rather fortifies it, and proves it in the love he feels for his neighbor. For he sees that the infidel is unfaithful, because he is without hope in me, and in my servant, because he does not love me, placing his faith and hope rather in his own sensuality, which is all that he loves. My faithful servant does not leave him because he does not faithfully love me, or because he does not constantly seek with hope in me for his salvation, inasmuch as he sees clearly the causes of his infidelity and lack of hope. The virtue of faith is proved in these and other ways. Wherefore, to those who need the proof of it, my servant proves his faith in himself and in his neighbor. And so justice is not diminished by the wicked man's injustice, but is rather proved, that is to say, the justice of a just man. Similarly, the virtues of patience, benignity, and kindness manifest themselves in a time of wrath by the same sweet patience in my servants. And envy, vexation, and hatred demonstrate their love, and hunger and desire for the salvation of souls. I say also to you, that not only is virtue proved in those who render good for evil, but that many times a good man gives back fiery coals of love, which dispel the hatred and rancor of heart of the angry. And so from hatred often comes benevolence, and that this is by virtue of the love and perfect patience which is in him, who sustains the anger of the wicked, bearing and supporting his defects. If you will observe the virtues of fortitude and perseverance, these virtues are proved by the long endurance of the injuries and detractions of wicked men, who, whether by injuries or by flattery, constantly endeavor to turn a man aside from following the road and the doctrine of truth. Wherefore, in all these things, the virtue of fortitude, conceived within the soul, preserves with strength, and, in addition, proves itself externally upon the neighbor, as I have said to you. And if fortitude were not able to make that good proof of itself, being tested by many contrarieties, it would not be a serious virtue founded in truth. End of excerpt from the dialogue by St. Catherine of Siena. Narrated by Tony Capobianco. Welcome to the Virgo Potens YouTube channel. If you enjoy this video, I invite you to visit the Virgo Potens website at virgopotens.org. Virgo Potens has articles, traditional Latin Mass resources, transcribed sermons, prayers in English and Latin, narrated videos of the Dolorous Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ by Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, and a spiritual warfare page. I offer the content on the website and YouTube channel for free, but this work is a full-time apostolate, and your support is needed. Please prayerfully consider supporting my work by praying for me, becoming a patron of Virgo Potens on Patreon, and or by purchasing one of my ebooks. If you'd prefer to give me a one-time contribution, I suggest that you do so by buying one of my ebooks. Links to my ebooks, as well as to Patreon, can be found at virgopotens.org. May the Virgin Most Powerful guide and protect you.